great to see you here again. We are at the third part of the video for lesson 10, and we start looking at procurement management. Now, the first thing to do is to define what is procurement about. Procurement is the process of finding and agreeing on terms and acquiring goods, services, or work from an external source, often via tendering or competitive bidding process. It involves generally making buying decisions under conditions of scarcity. Procurement is very important in project management and for any company or organization. Now, the thing is with procurement is that typically it is done by a procurement department, because the procurement department has the knowledge to deal with contracts, has the legal knowledge, and they also have to verify that the products they buy, that they are applicable, that they have the quality for what the company wants to do in their projects or in their operations. Typically, large companies have their own departments for procurement, and it may also be that in smaller companies it may be centralized with one manager, or you as a project manager, you may have the possibilities, you may have the authorization to deal with this. All depends on the way the organization is dealing with procurement in general. Now, the project manager, like I said before, in large projects and in large organizations, the project manager is not really involved with procurement. And the procurement will be managed by the procurement department. And we see that in tests and PMI and CAPM exams, that when we talk about procurement, this is typically the weak spot of the project managers. Now, when we look at contracts and you are a project manager, contracts can have legal consequences that exceed the legal knowledge of most project managers. You may be used to dealing with these elements, but in many cases, those legal terms and conditions may be very, very strange for you as a project manager when you don't have any legal knowledge. Now, the smaller companies, there you can be working as a project manager and do your own procurement. But it also depends how you deal with the financial people, with the legal people within the company, and somebody has to have the knowledge to deal with this. What you also can do is working with suppliers list, approved supplier lists. So basically, once you have that list available, as a project manager, you can use people on that list because they have been approved by the company. Now, when you look at some companies I was dealing with, once you get on the approved supplier list, you can in fact be engaged by the people. They can come to you directly, and there may be a lot of processes that have been set up so that the procurement process is really well documented. When we look at procurement, we have to look at some different stages of procurement, and there are 9 major steps over 3 stages, and we look at sourcing, purchasing, and of course payment. When we look at the sourcing stage, we identify the needs, we create purchase requests, and we assess vendors. When we look at the purchasing stage, we look at negotiating the terms, we create purchase orders, we receive and inspect the goods and the services, very important here. And finally, we have the payment stage. So when we have the matching is approved. Once we see that the goods have been or the services have been provided and they comply with the conditions, you can approve and pay the invoice. And of course, you have to keep everything in record for later references. Now, when we look at contracts, we look at key aspects that have to be in a contract. We always have to have an agreement with different parties, typically a buyer and a seller. What is not in the contract is not a part of the contract, and it cannot be enforced. So if certain things are not a part of the contract, you cannot enforce them. You cannot push the people to deal with them. You have to make another agreement. Now, when we look at an international environment, we look at the enforcement of the contract conditions that will be depending on the cultural and the local laws. So when you're working in an international environment, these elements can be quite challenging. Now, when we have a purchasing contract, it contains all the terms and conditions, and it's the team's responsibility to ensure that the procurement office has all the necessary information. So if you want to have a contract dealt by or done by the procurement department, that department needs to have all the necessary information. Now, there are different contract format possible. We can have agreements, we can have service level agreements or an SLA. It says what is the level of the service. You can have a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement. So there are different documents that can be used, different terms that can be used. Now, the seller who signed the contract can be named differently. It can be the contractor, can be the vendor, can be the service provider or the supplier. And the contract also states who becomes the owner of the final contract. Now, when we go through the procurement process, we have different stages that we can consider. First, we have to recognize the needs. What do we want to buy? What do we need? The second thing is that we have to send out a purchase requisition. We have to review the requests. Then we have to have a budget approval because we may have some budgetary elements already pre-approved. But once we have a review of the request, we select one and we have a formal approval for the budget to do that contract. Then we look at the quotation requests. We negotiate and make a contract. We receive the goods and the services. We do a three-way matching, so we see that all the work has been completed, that all the elements are there. So basically that everything complies with what we ordered. And then we invoice and we have approval of payments. And finally, we put everything in records. Now, when we look at a procurement, we also have to introduce what we call the procurement management strategy. Now, we have to build a procurement management strategy because it's a very important element to manage procurement effectively. We have to create that. And you see, this is more the specialty item for the procurement departments. There are 5 important steps in the creation of a procurement management strategy. So first of all, we have to have that procurement management strategy that we have to set up. Then we create a directory of preferred vendors. We invite pre-qualified vendors to bid and manage the contracts. We adopt appropriate vendor management best practices, and we measure, track, and analyze procurement data. So that was it for the third video for lesson 10. I'm looking forward to seeing you in our next video. Thank you and bye-bye.